to think tank type organizations. They do great work in awareness building, right? But when are these efforts going to reach beyond our own echo policy chambers? What is our society going to look like at the point where we feel like, okay, we've raised enough awareness and now we can actually get to addressing what normal people think of fake news? But there is hope. There are some really great programs that we funded as a community, a Western donor community, that do address root causes. These are two discrete, small, short examples that I think if we used as a model to create more programming like this might be able to really have an effect. So the first one happens to be run by IREX, which is the implementer of America House, so way to go IREX. The goal of this program, it's a media literacy program, was to enhance citizen capacity to establish reliability of news sources and content, as well as increase public demand for truthful reporting. And they did this by training 400 trainers, who then went out and trained 15,000 people across Ukraine in media literacy techniques, including how to know or to learn early on that you're being emotionally manipulated by one of those crazy titles you see on Facebook of news stories. Oops. Oh no, what have I done? Can you put it back? Thank you. And they also showed how to spot doctored photos and things like that. And they created a whole curriculum for these trainings with the help of Stop Fake and the Academy of Ukrainian Press. And after the training, the number of people who cross-checked sources increased by 29% over 3 months, which is a huge number. They also did an awareness raising program in Ukraine, an ad campaign, which reached, you can see the numbers here, 20 million TV viewers, 8 million radio listeners, 10,000 YouTube users, and maybe people at home. Basically, the ad says, information is a product, consume wisely. And after this ad campaign, IREX did polling, both before and after, and saw, I think, a 23% increase in the number of people who checked or who were aware of disinformation and the need to cross-check sources just after an ad campaign. This program ran for 9 months and had a very small funding level. I think it was about 600,000 Canadian dollars. Imagine what that could do if we funded it to a level that was a little bit, allowed it to reach all of the oblasts in Ukraine, for instance, or we funded it for more years than just 9 months. I think it could have a huge effect. It also, if media literacy curriculum was, new media literacy in particular, that focused on digital media literacy, was installed in schools, in workplaces, as part of training for government officials, this could have a huge effect. So we need to think about these things that aren't necessarily low-hanging fruit. The increase in population that understands media literacy, it's not going to be a quick curve, but it's a really important skill that we're not teaching right now, both in the United States and across Europe. And certainly this program didn't reach all 45 million Ukrainians, but it could have, I think, over time, a pretty large impact. I don't know why it's not working anymore, Sasha. I'm pressing it. Oops. Okay. Thanks. So, okay. Now it seems. Is it me? There we go. All right. So this is another program that I really like. It is run by Free Press Unlimited, which is out of Amsterdam. And they have a Russian language news exchange. Basically what this is a group of 50 news organizations that are local and independent across the 7 Eastern Partnership countries. And they've kind of established a system wherein you can apply for a grant to do some investigative reporting with the understanding that by writing the story, by taking this grant, when you publish it, it can then be repackaged and distributed across all the other platforms, anybody who wants it, who's a member of the News Exchange. And what's really great about this is that the stories are resonant to local populations in these Eastern Partnership countries, which I think is the key of what we're missing in media right now. When I was a kid, my parents used to get the local New Jersey newspaper, the Star Ledger. It was delivered to our house every day. And as I grew older, the Star Ledger got thinner and thinner, and the coverage in it became less and less specific to the particular town or state that we lived in. And so my parents eventually stopped subscribing to it. But when you think about someone who, for instance, might be a farmer in Iowa, and they don't have that quality local news to go to, and they look at something like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and they don't see anything that applies to their daily lives, that's when the trust gap starts widening between people and media. And I see the same thing in the Ukrainian information environment in my work with the ministry, working with Ukrainian journalists. Local Ukrainian outlets here are super interested in Ukrainian international affairs and how Ukraine is interacting with Europe. That's great. But people are also interested in why, for instance, their playground in the Dvor is getting torn down, or what's going on in a school in Kiev here. And it's really important to report on those local issues. And this Russian language news exchange facilitates that. It also trains its members in business skills, knowing that one day this program might not be there anymore. And they want them to be able to be self-sustaining, which is really important in today's journalism environment. And in a year, with just $1 million, it facilitated about 500 stories to be researched and exchanged, which were each viewed a minimum of 1 million times across platforms. Which again, this is peanuts in terms of foreign assistance, and it had a pretty large effect. So, how should we do this? How do we go about this? Should we just keep funding a bunch of projects like these, like IREX and Free Press Unlimited? Not exactly. It needs to be a whole cloth strategy. We can't just redirect money. There's another thing, there we go. We need to think about this as a whole. I'm not saying that we should just stop funding fact-checking sites. I'm not saying that we can only do stuff like this. Here's what I am saying. First, we need to continue strategically funding analytical fact-checking and consciousness-raising work. I heard a lot over the interviews that I did that folks were losing funding because priorities in terms of countries were shifting and they didn't have money to do their work anymore, or suddenly their funding was pulled and given to a new organization doing almost exactly the same thing. Instead, I would like to see longer term grants. I would like to see training for organizations that do a really great job to train other newer organizations and show them the ropes. Things like that are really important. We need to be strategic about this and not leave people to sink or swim when the threat is still there. Secondly, again, long-term investments, especially in skills-building programs and campaigns that deal with media literacy, that deal with investigative journalism, as well as media partnerships like the News Exchange, and study tours, I think, are also a great way for, especially within the Eastern European region, but maybe also for American journalists to come here and learn from the experience of Ukraine and other organizations, other countries that have dealt with this problem before we have. There we go. It helps when I do this little motion, I think. Across the board, I'd like us to see investing in longer programs with more flexible deliverables. So when the Ukraine crisis happened, we were a little bit caught off guard, and we do have these rapid response funding mechanisms. But when something changes rapidly, for instance, after the United States election, where it seemed very clear that Russia was going to go into Europe now and meddle in other elections, I'd like us to see I'd like to see us have longer, more flexible pots of money that we can then send around to deal with the crises as they happen. Right now, things are pretty rigid. In fact, one of the issues that I think is big for the coming years in Europe is that a lot of the countries that are dealing with fake news and disinformation right now are no longer on the list of assistance beneficiaries. They've graduated from foreign assistance. So countries like the Czech Republic and Poland, which are having a pretty big disinformation problem, are not able necessarily to receive the type of funding that Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia are able to receive because they're graduates of foreign assistance. So given the unique nature of the disinformation threat, I'd like to see us expand that list a little bit. I talked about the Rapid Response Fund already. And finally, we need to prioritize coordination between governments and multilateral structures. This is actually part of the recent Portman-Murphy counter-disinformation bill that was passed last year and President Obama signed. I'm not sure where that priority ranks for the current administration, but I would love to see my own government leading in the effort to coordinate between governments and multilateral structures. So, how do you fight disinformation in your daily life? I have two simple suggestions, and I'm very interested to hear yours when we discuss in just a little bit. The first one is to invest in journalism and actually pay for it, right? I love this cartoon of cavemen reading hieroglyphics and hitting a paywall. But really, we should all invest what it costs for a couple cups of coffee every month to pay for journalism, to support journalists, because the market that they're operating in right now is extremely tough, and the best thing that we can do as individual citizens is to support them this way. And then, of course, think before you share on Facebook. Read an article all the way through, and don't just share based on a headline. You all know how fake news spreads, and Facebook is one of the main ways. Facebook is now trying to get its own fact-checking platform in place so that it's automated within the social media platform itself. But you have a big part in that. And we can talk a little bit more as we discuss how you can engage people who are sharing fake news. I'm interested to hear your strategies because I myself have not figured it out. And finally, before I close today, this, as Christiane mentioned, is from the piece that I published in the Washington Post. I think it's important to know what winning the information war would look like. In my opinion, this is going to be people who are consuming news responsibly and using it to inform a healthy criticism of the government. I'm not saying that we should ever trust media or the government entirely, right? That's not how democracy works. But we want people to read the news responsibly and then say, hey, I don't like what my government is doing. I don't like what's going on in the school down the street. And I read it in the newspaper, and now I'm going to start a petition about it or go to a protest. These are the types of things that aren't really going on in a healthy way in democracies across Europe right now. And this is where we need to go to. But if we're going to do that, we need programming that teaches people how and makes journalism sustainable enough that it can address the problems that people actually have. And that's all I've got for you tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and I'd love to take your questions. I think there's a mic, which Sasha has. Anybody have questions?
Thank you for your speaking.
Thank you.
Does this sources of the fake news, does they observe the Ukrainian news? Because are they mostly focused on Russian news?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Does they somehow observe Ukrainian news? Because you must mostly say that they observe like Russian news. Is there take place fake news in Ukraine?
I think there's fake news everywhere. There was certainly a lot of fake news in the United States during the election, and yeah, we've seen Ukrainian sources of fake news propagated as well. I think all of these probably have a root in Russia, whether Russia, for instance, in the case of the election, used documents that it then released on WikiLeaks that news organizations then propagated. That's not necessarily fake news, like I was talking about at the beginning. It's still a form of disinformation, though. And yeah, I think there's fake news in Ukraine. There's fake news in Poland. In every country that I talked to, that I spoke with people in, there's fake news everywhere. Unfortunately, not all of it is necessarily propagated by Russia, but a majority of it, I think, especially in this region, is. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Vasil Babic. I work for international NGO Democracy Report International.
Cool.
And Ms. Yankovic, my question actually is about governmental agencies. There was harsh critique in Ukrainian political discourse, Facebook, within NGO activists about the Ministry of Truth or Ministry of Information in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on their activities and probably the same governmental activities in other countries in Europe?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I understand the desire behind to found parts of the government that deal with the disinformation crisis, but we have to be very careful, in my opinion. For instance, the Ministry of Information Policy, or even the Czech Hybrid Threat Center, or this new center that my own government is going to establish to fight disinformation. You need to be really careful to not trample on people's right to freedom of speech and freedom of information. The German government actually is now, I think, increasing its libel and slander laws in response to fake news that's happening. And I think that's also really dangerous. Again, especially in the post-Soviet environment, people are very sensitive about their right to consume information freely. So I think any government entity that is established needs to be very clear and transparent about what it's there for. Is it there to prosecute libel and slander cases? And if it is, it can't just prosecute against Russian disinformation. It has to do it when it sees it, for instance, in domestic outlets as well. Again, being very careful to be fully within the law and protect people's rights. This should be about protecting democracy, not minimizing people's right to freedom of speech and information. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Thanks a lot for your amazing presentation, and it was extremely interesting to hear your perspective as a foreigner on our Ukrainian, let's say mostly Ukrainian problems, and amazingly interesting to see those figures you analyzed. And my question is, you're mostly talking about the trust, which is really a problem in Ukrainian society now. We feel it really, the gap of trust to our government on all the levels probably. But in your opinion, is it a problem of media mostly and disinformation, or maybe the problem of government itself?
So I didn't talk about government at all, although I've obviously been dealing a little bit with that in my own work here in Ukraine, and hope to one day do that back at home. I think it's a problem on multiple levels. Government also obviously needs to be extremely truthful in the way it communicates to the media. It needs to communicate positive stories about the good things that are happening, but also not be afraid to communicate failures. And I think that's one way that all governments could improve their communications. I don't think media is necessarily at fault for the trust gap. I think, unfortunately, the business environment that media organizations are put in right now is to blame for it, which is, again, turning media away from local stories that might not be as popular to things that are more clickbaity, to things that are bad news, that are scandalous, that get them more eyes on their website, more papers bought, things like that. I don't think you're to blame for that, the media. I think it's just the business environment, and as long as we strategically think about how to change that, both the media and governments who are supporting media, I think we can avert the ship before it hits the iceberg, so to speak. Thanks for your question.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm consulting a Swedish governmental agency on project related to making local power more transparent.
Great.
Your research is quite comprehensive with a lot of data, especially about trust to public institutions. There is also one more dimension related to local power.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when we are comparing the level of trust to government, it's about 10% in different researches. We have the number of trust to local power.
In Ukraine?
It's much higher, about 35%.
Yeah.
So really, in such perspective, it's not enough, and we have a floor for improvement, but there is still a huge information vacuum and distrust vacuum on local level among local journalists and local officials with whom I am working personally every day. So maybe fast facts, recommendations from you, how to raise awareness among local officials and local journalists to translate and deliver messages more well balanced and adequate. Thank you.
Thanks for that really interesting comment and question. I totally agree, and I think the local level is actually our way in to repairing the trust gap, in my opinion. When people can actually see the changes that are taking place around them, things that happen in the Rada, they're passing a lot of great reforms, but do people feel it on a day-to-day basis? Probably not. But and I always use the example of the playground in the Dvor, I don't know why, but when the playground in the Dvor gets repainted or repaired and your kids are out there playing on it, that's something really tangible for your life. Or, if a road is repaired, for instance. These are things that really affect people's daily lives. So I think the more local government can listen to the people and then respond to their concerns, and the same goes for media. The more media can help be the bridge between people and their government, be the watchdog on local government, then the more that relationship will grow and prosper. And it's really interesting to hear that people have more trust in local government than national government in Ukraine. And I think that would be true. Actually, I'm not sure. What do the Americans in the room think? Do you think that's true for our society? Do you know who your local officials are?
I feel like it may be true in the United States because people have more access, I feel like, to their local governments than they do their federal representatives. There's more knocking on doors in local government, I feel like, things like that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that may be part of it.
Yeah. It's interesting, but I do think that that's the key, especially for media as well, to play that joining role between people and their governments. So I think that's a really interesting thing for anybody who's looking for their next project. That could be it. Any other questions?
Hi, Nina.
Hi.
Good evening. It's good to see you.
Good to
Maxim
see you.
Piak from Global Ukraine from Ukraine. I promised you that I will attend your event, so I had to
Yes.
leave Kiev Security Forum to
Thank
be
you.
here.
I really
So it means
appreciate
that my promise wasn't a fake. So I am here.
Not disinformation.
Right. So you just also mentioned NATO Stratcom as one of the ex-co-authors of the latest research of NATO Stratcom, which is Stratcom Labs, about the role of humor in strategic communications. I think I will not agree because this research is probably one of the most popular now. It has become one of the most popular, but mostly in Russian media. So yeah. But my question is, you just said, so you just provided us with the more general information, but did you try to examine specifically countries like Ukraine or Moldova or maybe some regions? Because it might seem, or it seems to me that the disinformation strategies in those countries, in those regions are pretty different. Thank you.
So I did interviews in 6 different countries, and I picked them based on projects that I found interesting. I obviously couldn't go everywhere, so I went to Latvia, Poland, Czech Republic. I've been in Ukraine. I also went to Brussels and London to talk to folks. And I actually thought I would find differing response across the board, but really what I found that united everyone, even though they all have very different media environments, very different relationships with Russia, very different problems with their relationships vis-a-vis Russia, the trust gap is still there, and kind of the response is still very top level or awareness raising across the board as far as I thought. Obviously this is not comprehensive, I could not talk to everyone, but it was the common thread amongst everyone that I talked to. In Poland, for instance, they don't really do that much debunking, but they have a really huge trust gap between the people and government and media. And they're kind of talking about disinformation on a wider regional level, and again, awareness raising. The MOD has done some conferences and things like that. They're training officials to spot it, but not talking to the people in the country who are the ones unknowingly spreading rumors that have been propagated by Russia. So this is the common thread. Even though everyone's got kind of a different response, everything is still very surface level, and I'd like to see everybody go a little bit deeper. And I did read the NATO Labs or Stratcom study. I think the things that don't get me wrong, I think the Center of Excellence is great. The guys there gave me a wonderful presentation. That's what military men tend to do. They had a whole slideshow prepared for me. They were really, really thorough and comprehensive, and I think they're very smart. But I want to see those studies reach more people. How can we repackage them to get to the people who might not know what the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence is? It's a question that maybe you should think about. Anybody else? And I think this might need to be one of the last questions, maybe one or two more.
Hi, my name is Elena Steiner. You said a lot about how we can address this question to Ukrainian, European, American auditory, and still Russian citizens are the biggest and the most affected by Russian propaganda campaign group of people. So how do you think whether there is any chances to address this debunking stuff to Russian citizens, especially taking into account that it's almost impossible to be an independent journalist in Russia, and if you work from any European or American organization, you are labeled as untrustworthy?
Yeah, oh man, from my time working on Russia, I'm very aware of the risks that journalists and activists take in doing their really important work in Russia, and it's definitely a problem. I focused on the European information environment, obviously, because there's a little bit more room for improvement there. The situation actually, I think, has a potential solution, and in Russia, the situation is much more difficult. The best thing that I could say is that we need to be delivering these messages through entertainment means, and Peter Pomerantsev has written a lot about this. Again, it's really hard because the entire information market is controlled by Putin, but I think if there's a way to deliver it, obviously hitting people over the head with what most people would call anti-propaganda is not going to work, but slipping it in through talk shows, soap operas, these things would be really interesting, and I think is a way for Russian society as a whole, artists and thinkers of that nature, to respond without being overtly political. I think in terms of the Western response or any Western support to this arena, that gets a little bit sticky because, again, you're getting into artistic freedom, editorial policies there. That's not something we tend to do openly, but I think there's room for some creative thinking that might not be in the news realm. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't read it to read Peter Pomerantsev's book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, about his time as a TV producer in Russia during the 90s. It can really inform some of the debates that we're having today. Thanks for that excellent question. Anybody else? One last question? Okay.
Hi, my name is Roman. I am from Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and probably my question would be: there is tensions in Western academia that actually debunking myth and fakes actually empower them and make them more sound, I don't know, brilliant, and help to raise more people. Do you agree with this tension, and probably we should do something else from this?
Well, I think some debunking is important. I do agree with you, but let me give you one example. If you're familiar with the Leaf case in Germany, which happened, I think, at the beginning of 2016 in January. So it was this fake news story that was originally propagated by a fringe Russian outlet that said a 13-year-old girl of German-Russian origin had been raped by a bunch of refugees. It turned out not to be true. And by the time it was debunked and proven to be debunked, it had really gained a lot of notoriety. If a government or another organization like Stop Fake or any of its German brothers and sisters were able to have debunked that story earlier on, it may not have taken on the life that it did. And if we had not debunked it, who knows what would have happened. I think it already had an effect on German public opinion in that case because it was allowed to take on a life of its own. But debunking can be really important sometimes. And like I said, I think it's important for analytical reasons as well. However, I do agree that it does sometimes lend notoriety to outlets and stories that should not be getting the attention that we give them through debunking. It also allows Russia to set the narrative. There's one more thing that I wanted to say, and it has slipped my mind. I'm going to think for 5 more seconds. Nope, it's gone. I'll try to remember afterward, but I do agree with you. Oh, no, I remember what it was. It is that there have been studies that prove no matter how many times something is debunked or proven to be false, and we saw this with our own election in the fall, people remember the false thing rather than the true thing because it's been in their brain longer. And so we run the risk of doing that and kind of wasting resources there. So that's why I'd like to see some of those resources diverted to projects that are more long-term in general. And thank you for the great question and the work that you do with UCMC. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I'm happy to talk afterward if you have any more questions, comments, concerns. Follow me on Twitter. Share my op-ed if you feel so inclined. Thank you. Thanks for coming.